Well, welcome everybody to this next episode of I Learned About Maintenance Human Factors from That. I'm really delighted to be joined again by Scott Rexwinkle. For those of you who haven't met Scott yet, then he introduced himself in a bit more detail in episode 1. And I strongly suggest that you go and check that video out. That was a great conversation that we had about a different aircraft accident. Well, today we're going to explore the human factors from a maintenance perspective that were involved in this particular accident. And yeah, Scott, we've got a really good case to look at tonight.
Great to be here, Sam. Yeah, good to see you again. It's been a little while, and it's good to be back on again.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a good accident to look at from a human factor perspective. And I once heard a colleague of mine say that the regulations have been written in blood. Something's happened. They've written some regulations and then we've learned from that. So anyway, on the 8th of January, 2003 at 8:47 in the morning, Air Midwest Flight 5481, which was a Raytheon Beechcraft 1900, crashed shortly after takeoff from the runway 18 right at Charlotte Douglas International Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this resulted from a stall on climb out. The aircraft crashed after going into a dive, and it unfortunately went straight into the corner of a maintenance hangar, which killed everybody on board. Now, on the night, and here's a little bit of background to what was going on with the aircraft, but on the night of January the 6th and 7th, the aircraft had undergone a maintenance check, and there'd been 6 flight legs the day before this particular accident with no reports of any abnormal handling, which I think as we begin to go through this and unpack it a little bit, could be a bit surprising maybe. Since maintenance, the aircraft had flown a total of 9 flight legs. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the crash was the aircraft's loss of pitch control during takeoff. The dispatch release showed that there were a maximum of 32 bags allowed on board. And this is interesting. The number of bags loaded on this particular day included 23 that were checked and 8 that were carry-ons. So that's a total of 31. Prior to takeoff, the pilots had discussed the weight and balance of the aircraft, and this was a result of the ramp agent mentioning to the captain that 2 of the bags seemed very heavy, between 70 to 80 pounds each, although they weren't marked as such. Now, according to the ramp agent, the captain had indicated that the extra weight would be okay because they had a child on board. Standard weights had been used to calculate adults as weighing 175 pounds. And we'll come back to that, actually, the average weights a little bit later. There was excessive rearward center of gravity and weight outside of the applicable maximum weight for the aircraft. And that was determined to have contributed to the accident. Anyway, the aircraft was cleared for takeoff. It rotated, began to climb out, and the captain called for the landing gear to be retracted. At 90 feet above the ground, the flight data recorder showed the aircraft pitched up to 20 degrees and the airspeed was 139 knots. At this time, the first officer and captain were fighting for the controls and trying to get the aircraft to pitch down with the stall warning horn blaring. A few seconds later, the flight data recorder shows the aircraft pitch angle as 54 degrees. The captain radioed air traffic control stating that they had an emergency. The aircraft stalled, rolled to the left with a maximum left roll of 127 degrees, so pretty dramatic. And at this point, the airspeed was 31 knots, so in a fully developed stall. The pilots tried to recover. They were unable, and the aircraft crashed into the corner of the US Airways maintenance hangar. Pretty rapid onset of events there, Scott.
Yeah, it was something that happened extremely fast. Did not allow the pilots time to really react to the situation, diagnose the situation, or come up with any sort of remedy other than just trying to muscle this thing to where they wanted it, which they were unsuccessful in doing.
Before we go into the maintenance human factors side of this, Scott, I think it's, the conversation that we had offline about the pilots, the fact that the bags seemed heavier than they should have been, the fact that average weights were used, the fact that the pilots accounted for a heavier bag by saying, hey, we can offset against, a small child who we've taken on board. There's a lot of things going on here, a lot of assumptions. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. It's one of those instances again where we start talking about the stack of events or things that lead up to the accident itself. It's never typically one event or one item that leads to an accident. It's the stack of errors or misconceptions, I guess. Yeah, I think that you're very right. When you start to make these assumptions, you are removing the buffer, the
Mhm.
safety buffer that's automatically built into the flight. As you continue to make the assumptions and you say, well, we might be a little bit over gross, we'll be okay. All right,
Mhm.
there's one level gone. And as you go, well, it might be a little bit out of CG, but you know what? We'll be okay. You keep doing that and you keep reducing your margin of safety until that margin is so thin that one more thing goes wrong and it's all over.
So, from a maintenance perspective, leading up to this flight, so we know that maintenance took place between the 9th to the 6th of January and the morning of the 7th. 2003, the aircraft went under a Detail 6 maintenance check. That was between the night of the 6th and the morning of the 7th. Air Midwest contracted with Raytheon Aerospace LLC, which was known as RALLC, to provide mechanics, so contractors, quality assurance inspectors, and a site manager. RALLC contracted with another organization to supply the mechanical workforce here. And the RALLC quality assurance inspector on duty that night was providing on-the-job training to two of the contracted mechanics. So those two contracted mechanics were brought in by RALLC on behalf of Air Midwest. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, and that's what it sounds like to me. Typically, when you are on contract maintenance here in the U.S., you are an A&P.
Yep.
And you're contracted in on a contract basis instead of a permanent hire basis to do the work.
They were given specific tasks associated with the D6 maintenance check. Neither contracted mechanics had previously performed the complete D6 inspection. That's worthy of note. One of the mechanics was receiving on-the-job training, so OJT, and they were assigned to inspect and check the elevator control cable tension. The D6 inspection procedures checklist indicated that cable tension was to be checked according to the procedures in Chapter 27 of the Aircraft Maintenance Manual. The first step on the D6 work card showed that the mechanic recorded the temperature as 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The next step on the D6 work card indicated that the airplane nose up, or ANU, and airplane nose down elevator cable tensions needed to be measured. The mechanic in interview stated that he used a cable tensioner and the tensioners were low, or tensions were low. He then stated that he referred to the AMM, section 273002, elevator control rigging, maintenance practices, and the elevator cable tension graph. Under the supervision of the quality inspector, so the quality inspector was supervising, and this guy who's doing on-the-job training, who'd never done the task before, claims that he worked to adjust the cables to the correct tension range. The aircraft maintenance record for the non-routine item on the 6th of January indicated that the elevator tension was low and a required inspection item, or RII stamp, appeared within that block in the paperwork. That's in the report. You can see that. The form also indicates that the cable tension was adjusted in accordance with, and that operational checks were normal. Interestingly, possibly most importantly, the mechanic stated that while adjusting the cable tension, he bypassed several steps of the complete elevator control system rigging procedure. Quality inspector also stated that he and the mechanic had discussed which steps to bypass and that he allowed the mechanic to adjust only the cable tensions. The aircraft flew 9 flights prior to the accident flight, and due to the incorrect rigging, the elevator airplane nose down only achieved 7 degrees where the usual forward range was 15.6 degrees. And that is why the aircraft, the pilots lost control of the aircraft when they took off and swung the gear up, and they just couldn't get the nose down, and the aircraft went into stall and crashed. Now, Scott, I know you're just chomping at the bit to get going with this one.
There's a lot in there, isn't there?
I think we definitely need to pull out this stuff, about the mechanic who stated they decided to bypass several steps. The quality inspector, I found this interesting. The quality inspector stated that he and the mechanic had discussed which steps to bypass. The mechanic was OJT. The mechanic had never done the job before. What kind of discussion can go on with somebody who's never done the job before and who actually is being supervised?
And that's the thing, you've got a supervisor here who is instructing someone who's never done the job before to bypass steps within the procedure itself. So you've got a supervisor who is not even teaching the correct procedure, right? Who's automatically going to ingrain into this person that you don't need to do these steps. So even if we have in this situation here, was somewhat, I guess, it may have been somewhat of a latent failure in a way, right? Because the rigging itself, as we've seen, the aircraft flew several legs before the accident happened. It took a certain set of circumstances with loading, weight, and everything to get this to a position where this misrigging actually showed itself, right? So if that's the case, if let's say it was 300 flights or 300 legs before this accident happened and this maintenance error showed up, how many more aircraft would this guy have rigged thinking, hey, I've done it before. Hey, I've bypassed these steps before and nothing's ever happened. We're good. And he continues to do that same type of procedure and bypassing steps. How many more aircraft would have been out there with the same rigging issue and just waiting for a situation where the weight and balance was right for another accident to happen? So this is, while it's also interesting, a lot of the stuff that they were doing technically was within the regulations, right? You can do OJT. The person doing the supervising just has to be made available to the person who's not completed the task before. So they did technically fall within the regulations on how they were going about doing things. The areas they fell out of line with regulations were the bypassing of steps and procedures outlined in the maintenance manual.
Yeah, I think that's, there's quite a few really great points you've just pulled out there. I just made a couple of notes.
I dropped a lot of stuff out real quick. Sorry.
You did. No, this is great. I mean, this is, this is now moving into, if you've not seen these episodes yet, this is now moving into the whole discussion. The main thing that we want to pull out of these is not to attribute blame to anybody. It's to try and pull out the lessons we can learn, because it's I think there's a couple of ways really you can learn lessons. One is you make the poor mistakes yourself and you get bitten, and you learn the hard way, or you observe what's gone on before and you have you're looking around and you're learning from the mistakes of others. And I think that's the benefit of what we're doing now, is we've taken this accident, we're trying to unpack it, and these are our opinions about what's gone on. And I think you alluded to it earlier, Scott. We're looking back on this with 2020. We're looking back on this with hindsight because we now know the outcome. And bringing that full circle around to what you were saying about the quality inspector and the mechanic, there was something going on that night that led to them having a discussion about deciding missing steps. And I don't think the report really went into it in too much detail, but I wonder what human factors were, they were influenced from that night. Those of you who have worked night shifts or even day shifts or on the line, you might have flight ops or maintenance control yelling down the phone saying, hey, we need this aircraft. We've got a flight. We haven't got any other aircraft. All the other aircraft are on the ground. We need this one fixed. What was going on? I think there's so much there, but you pulled it out a minute ago. The quality inspector who was providing that on-job training should have set the example.
Yes.
And that for anybody watching this episode and you're you're acting as a mentor, or you're acting as an assessor or an instructor, or in some form of in some role where people are looking up to you and people are learning from you. It's absolutely imperative that you really think through what you're teaching them. Tell me what's going on here with just maintenance in general and maintenance error. Do you think that mechanics and aircraft engineers, do you think they're always aware of the potential future consequences of maybe the way they're carrying out a particular task?
I think it's something that at least for me was taught pretty early on, is to be mindful of that. Would you go flying this? Think about what you're doing and the long-term repercussions of what it is that you're doing. But in this instance, especially, you've got a new guy on, like I said before, where he's being told to skip procedures, but I don't think that he fully appreciated the fact that when you're skipping these procedures, what are the long-term repercussions of skipping these procedures? What could potentially go wrong? And not thinking through that, right? Because as a mechanic, that is the thing. Like, you can do something inadvertently, or that can lead to a circumstance that sits lying in wait, or another circumstance to be met that causes a fault, right? And so you've got to be very conscious of this. And that goes for even like, not in this case, it was the rigging issue. It could be, I'm installing a new electrical line or a fuel line, or I'm just replacing a hydraulic line even. And if I don't route that correctly, or I don't clock it correctly, and it's now chafing on a bulkhead or a lightning hole, and all of a sudden it's rubbed through after 40 hours of flight time, and they lose hydraulic pressure. Well, that's due to the fact that I wasn't mindful of what I was doing, my installation process, my routing, or whatever it happens to be, that causes this potential for something down the road, be it 1 hour or be it 40 years. Hopefully not 40 years. Hopefully it's looked at before 40 years. But I'm just trying to paint that picture. Like, it can range a very large span of time before that becomes an actual issue. But that's something you have to be very mindful as a mechanic, or as an A&P, or as a B1, as you guys call them there, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely, Scott. And I think that's, it's something I've always tried to encourage the people who have come through the classes that I've run, where we've run this accident as a case study that the guys have looked at from a human factor perspective. Is, I've reiterated time and time again, you might be tasked to go do a job, and it might seem like a meaningless task, or it might be just, I've got to go, I don't know, do this inspection again. I never find anything wrong there. Why do I need to look there? Or I think as an aircraft mechanic engineer, I think it's really important to think, if I don't do this right, what's the worst that could happen? Great question to ask. What could be the potential consequence? And if you need to learn more about the system, learn more about the system, because it will only make you better at what you do.
Absolutely. And I think you had outlined the fact that, like, these maintainers, these contract workers, and this quality inspector, the number of hours that they had been working in the days up to and the day including the accident, with me was quite astonishing. You have, let's say here, the quality inspector, you had on the 4th and 5th working 19 hours, and the 5th to 6th 9.5 hours, and the 6th and 7th you had another 15.5 hours. Those are big days. And I don't know how many people have, I'm sure most mechanics have at some point in time in their career had that shift where it just seems like it keeps going and going, and you keep having more put on your lap, and you're all of a sudden working overtime, and you're basically working a double shift. Well, at the end of that double shift, in a 15, 16 hours, I can tell you from my personal experience and how my body reacts to that. I get really fuzzy behind the eyes. Everything seems to kind of move in the slow motion, kind of, wobble almost. And I'm done. And so you have not only the quality inspector, but you had, the mechanic. He was putting in big hours as well. The 4th and 5th, 17.5 hours. The 5th and 6th, he had an 8-hour day. But then again, on the 6th and 7th, he had another 14 hours. I mean, even looking at like we use those personal minimums cards that you have, and then we can even look at like what the FAA produces, and then I know this is something else that other people use as well. The Dirty Dozen.
Yeah.
And you start to go, and like you said, we're looking back at this because we know the outcome and we know what was done. And so we try and put this, I guess, analysis to it, right? And really look into it. And we start looking at Dirty Dozen and we can go start checking off. Well, yeah, that was a contributor. Lack of communication was lack of knowledge. Yeah, lack of knowledge was this guy was his first time doing this job. And even some of these other more obscure ones where you're like, oh, maybe lack of assertiveness, right? The guy that is the contractor, right? The contract hire doing this for his first time. What position is he in to start questioning a supervisor? The supervisor is the one that's supposed to have the most knowledge and teaching you how to do the new procedure, but he's telling you to skip steps.
Yeah.
But if you, as that new hire, don't feel like you're in a position to question the supervisor or have that assertiveness to go, hey, well, why are we skipping these steps? You know, should I be skipping these steps? Or telling the supervisor, no, you know what? Let's do this as the maintenance manual says to do it. Let's not skip these steps. But then again, it comes to that hierarchy where you're the contract hire. Do you have that ability to actually, you know, voice those concerns? Fatigue, absolutely. Lack of resources, absolutely. You know, there's all these different things that come in. You know, pressure. We don't know. Maybe pressure was part of this, where they need to get the aircraft out. Lack of awareness. You know, so we do have. It's interesting if an A&P goes through and starts to, you know, B1 goes through and looks at the Dirty Dozen list and just read it. And every once in a while, just review it and make yourself, you know, aware of the situations and what you want to avoid. And I think it will help you out in leaps and bounds to help you avoid the situation and not put yourself in those positions.
Yeah, definitely.
Or at least make you able to identify them and avoid it, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So what 3 things can we take away from this? These are 3 things that we've identified. So the first, identify the human factors that might put you in a position where you're tempted to skip steps. You know, there's so many benefits of identifying the human factors that we're currently experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you can look inward, right, and take that card and really honestly evaluate yourself, right? It's easy to go through the card and go, check. I'm good. Let's go. But to honestly look and evaluate yourself, look inward, evaluate yourself, is such an important trait and character in an A&P or a B1 to be able to do that, because you have to be able to identify the issues that you personally may have prior to even starting the task. But not only starting the task, but it's also important to evaluate yourself throughout that day going, how am I doing physically here? Am I fatigued? Do I need to just step back, take a break? But to be able to continually do that self-evaluation throughout your day, throughout your project, throughout your task, and take the steps necessary to stay safe, make it right, and complete the task as it is specified by the maintenance manual and by your organization.
Number 2, always consider the wider picture and ask yourself, if I don't do this correctly, what is the worst that could happen?
Yeah, and because you always have to think of, especially on the maintenance side of things, there are long-term effects to what I do. It may not show up today. It may not show up tomorrow. It may not show up next week, but at some point it will show up. And if I don't pay attention to what I'm doing and think about the long-term effects of it, it may rear its ugly head at some point here, and it's not going to be pretty. So you've got to really think ahead of what you're doing and what the long-term repercussions of those actions are.
And the long-term repercussions of not doing it correctly, then being mindful of, well, what happens if the next person comes along and doesn't do it correctly? What's, you know, that's just compounding the issue, and the error is going to come to light. Really important.
And, you know, and I guess for me, the third thing I would take away from this is more from a supervisor's standpoint. If I am the one supervising and I'm the one providing OJT, when we're thinking about the long-term repercussions of something, what are the long-term repercussions of me providing an OJT that's not correct? What are the long-term repercussions of me teaching a new trainee or a new employee shortcuts.
Yep.
Or that taking shortcuts is okay, or that removing items from a checklist are okay. We really have to look at that and know that we want to teach the people coming up through our industry and through our organizations that we need to follow the procedures that are set forth because they're there for a reason. If we're teaching bad habits, we're going to get bad habits out of the people coming in. And it's going to turn into this perpetual wheel of, people that don't complete tasks correctly, and you're going to have a poor organizational culture. You need to develop that, and by doing the right way and instilling the right motivations and habits into the new incoming employees, and it comes from the top.
Scott, always a pleasure.
Sam, it's been great.
Thank you very much. We just really dug into this a little bit. Underneath this video, you'll find some resources that we've put up. There's a great video that the FAA has produced about fatigue called Grounded. I'd recommend you check that out. That's great. All right. Till next time. Take care.
Thanks.